For the past 5 years or so, I have been noticing what I like to think of as a board game renaissance. Okay, it might strike you as kind of a weird term at first. You wouldn't think something like board games or tabletop games, things like Monopoly or Clue, the things that you played as a kid with your mom and dad, whether forcibly or willingly. You wouldn't think those kinds of things could experience a sort of renaissance. Because Renaissance, right, is usually something that pertains to art, right, to art or science or abstract thought or something like that. But I think what you'll find, at least what I hope I can communicate after this video, is that all of those things can, in some form or another, be found in tabletop games. Okay, but I'll explain that a little bit later. So what I want you to do first is just think back to the last board game you played. Okay, so think back, what was the last game that you played? Maybe you didn't like it, maybe it's been years, maybe you play video game or play board games every week. The experience can be totally up to you, right? But think about the experience, okay? Think back to what it was like, okay? Now, if you're like me, if you are like many of my friends, you might look back on board games very fondly. Okay, you might look back on the times that you played board games with your friends and think about the memories that were made, right? Some of the laughs that were shared. Or perhaps there was some kind of seemingly insurmountable challenge that you and your friends worked together to overcome. Or perhaps there was some insurmountable challenge that you and your friends failed to make it through, right? At any rate, I think pretty much everyone has some kind of memory associated with board games, whether that is bad or good, okay? In other words, it probably left you with a story to tell, okay? And this leads me to the point overall of this video that I want to talk about for the rest of it, is this idea of board games as a storytelling medium, okay? Board games as a storytelling medium. Let's take an example. Let's have an example board game that we can use as our lens for looking at board games as a storytelling medium. I have chosen something called Pandemic, okay? So Pandemic is a cooperative game, okay? It's a cooperative game, which means you play with other people, where there are 4 deadly viruses that in some way or another have outbroken across the whole world. And it's up to you and your friends, the fellow researchers and scientists, right? That's what you take on the role of, is researchers and scientists, to discover the cure for this disease and prevent a total world devastation at the hands of this malicious bug, okay? So that's our game, okay? It's called Pandemic. That's our game for today that we're going to use as our lens. I want to explain and kind of recap what the core parts of a story are. Okay, this will help us to understand how in the world a board game could ever suffice, ever measure up to the idea of a storytelling medium, okay, a way to share stories. So, stories are made up of 5 key parts, okay, 5 key parts. And these, I think, are going to be very familiar to all of you, right? Even if you're not super into reading or writing. So, of course, the first one is the characters, okay? Who the story centers around, right? The people, okay? Now, I'm going to talk about characters last, actually, okay? I'm going to talk about that last, okay? And I'll tell you why. So, the next one is plot, okay? And plot is simply just what happens along the way, okay? It is the recounting of the events. So first the main characters went here and they did this, and then this happened, and then the bad guy came out of nowhere and they had this huge fight, and then the good guys overcame and they won, okay? That is a very hyper simplified idea of a plot, right? Of course, as you know, plots are infinitely more complex than that. So good story will, of course, have a much more complex chain of events than that. Plot actually is another thing I'm going to be relating to Pandemic last, okay? So characters and plot I'm pushing off a little bit later, and you will understand why, okay? Another important and key element, of course, in a story is the setting, right? So setting is basically the place where the story takes place, right? So in this case, in Pandemic, the setting is planet Earth, right? The setting is that you are amongst other scientists and researchers, then you are traveling all across the world trying to solve the mystery of this terrible virus. Okay, that is the setting of Pandemic. And of course, the next thing we have is the conflict. Okay, and I've kind of already talked a little bit about this. The conflict of Pandemic is that you are trying to stop this terrible virus from eradicating the human race, right? Because every turn, in case you haven't played the game, every turn that goes by, more of the virus is unleashed onto the world. Okay, more people are infected, and if left unchecked, there's this mechanic in the game called outbreaks, where the more of the virus is clumped together and piled up in one city, the greater chance it has of outbreaking and spreading to other cities. It's really scary, honestly. When you play the game, it makes you nervous. It puts you on edge, right? That's the tension, okay? That's the tension that's found in a conflict. And of course, we always have the resolution, okay? It's where everything turns out relatively okay, I suppose, depending on the story. Everything turns out okay, and the good guys win, traditionally. Now, going back to characters, okay? So the characters in Pandemic are researchers and scientists, like I said, but in reality, the characters are you, okay? You are the one taking agency in this story. And by extension, as a result of that, you are the one driving the plot, okay? So the events of the story, the things that happen, are entirely dependent on your decisions, okay? You are the main agent of this plot. You and your fellow players are the main characters. And of course, the resolution is when the game ends. And hopefully, right, you and your fellow characters have eradicated the virus and solved the problem, right? Because if you do, if you find the cure for all 4 diseases, you win the game. And that's it. That is the end of the game. That is the resolution, okay? The conflict has been solved. So what I've done so far is related different elements in the board game to the main 5 elements of a story. But does that really prove that board games can be a storytelling medium? Does that really prove my point? Well, personally, I think yes. And let me tell you a little bit more of why. People naturally gravitate towards stories, right? Stories are a cross-cultural phenomenon, essentially, and they span the entirety of our known history almost. I'm not going to try to make claims about different ancient stories found in prehistoric civilizations. I'm not a history buff, okay? But I just know that throughout history, even back to ancient history, stories have definitely been a huge part. We grow up hearing stories, right? We are almost trained, we're raised to gravitate towards stories in some way, right? So our parents maybe, or a other guardian, a significant person in our life, might read to us or just tell us stories about their life, things that happened in their lives. For example, my mom used to read to me when I was a kid. I know many parents have done that with their kids as well. And also uncles and aunts and grandparents have done the same thing. And even if stories aren't something you really care too much about, well, just think about your daily life, right? Think about what you do when you see one of your friends whom you haven't seen in a while, right? Maybe one of your friends at school or at work that you really like. You haven't seen them all week, and so you want to do what? Catch up, yeah? So that term catch up is technically a form of storytelling, right? Catch me up. What's been going on in your life, right? And that opens the door for you to tell me what's been happening, okay? It's not going to be as cohesive and tense and conflictive of a story as you might find in a book or a movie or whatever. There's not going to be necessarily this complex plot all pieced together. But even in a catch-up of how your week's been going, the 5 core elements are still kind of there. You have the main character, which is you. You have the plot, which is what happened throughout the week. The setting, which is the places you were through the week. You have the conflict, which is maybe a small problem or a question or an issue you had or a situation you found yourself in. And you have the resolution, which is what you did about it or what happened in the end. So I think because of that, we can see proof that human beings are all about this idea of shared experience, right? So stories are shared experiences. Why do we tell stories? It helps us connect with each other, yeah? So I want to tell people what I've been doing in Spain. I want to tell people some of the funny things that have happened to me, some of the remarkable experiences I've had, because I don't want to experience those things alone. I don't want to be the only one who remembers those things that happened. Because if I don't tell anyone, then when I get old and pass away, then my memories will die with me. So I think there's this desire for people to pass on their memories just for the sake of bits and pieces of their life being immortalized in some way. I think we can definitely see this idea of shared experience occurring in board games, right? Because when you play through a game of Pandemic, with all its twists and turns and dramatic things that happen throughout, you and your friends are going to remember that. You're going to remember that tension that you both felt at the same time, and then the relief that you felt when all 4 diseases were finally cured. If you still don't believe me, pick up your phone and open Instagram. What's the first thing you see? It's literally a row of stories, right? They're literally called stories. It's just a short, quick little recap of what that person has been up to today. Maybe just one little bit. I don't know what you call them. Slide, maybe? I don't know. I've been teaching too much. One little section, and that's it. Okay, maybe they have a coffee cup and they're studying. Okay, that's your story. Or it could be something as long as 20 or 30 pieces. I have seen those too. And it's the same for Facebook. Okay, so Facebook now has a story function as well, which I think is because Facebook owns Instagram now, which I didn't realize. I just found that out. So obviously they're going to want to have that kind of cross-platform similarity, I think. And even WhatsApp, I've just realized, has a story function that no one uses, but it's technically there if you want it. So we have all these outlets for telling stories. We have all these outlets for shared experience, especially on social media and, of course, YouTube as well. And I think board games are no exception to that, right? I think a good board game designer is going to create a game that can essentially cultivate shared experiences and cultivate shared stories. Of course, not all board games are going to make equally good stories because not all board games are created equal. I would rather play Pandemic or Settlers of Catan than Monopoly 7 days a week, right? Just because I enjoy Pandemic and those other games way more than I have ever enjoyed Monopoly. But maybe we could create a good story out of Monopoly too. Maybe we could talk about how I put my friend in jail 15 times in one game. Who knows? I don't even know if that's possible. It's been so long since I've played that game. But nonetheless, you still have a potential for something funny there. And I don't think Pandemic is the only game that accomplishes this. If you're not unfamiliar with it, the idea behind the game Dungeons and Dragons, infamous though it may be, is literally collaborative storytelling. You create and write literally your own character with their own flaws and talents and fears and desires. And then they're put into this world, this setting, to play out the plot line of their story. Then the person who runs the game, who creates the settings, known as the dungeon master or the game master, will provide the players with a conflict that they can then work through for a prospective resolution. So the entire game of Dungeons & Dragons, if you strip away all of the rules and the papers and the dice, which is what everyone sees on the outside, you are left with a collaborative storytelling experience. And I waited till later to mention Dungeons & Dragons because I wanted to show that other games that are not primarily storytelling games can be used in this fashion too. So Dungeons & Dragons was designed for storytelling, okay? That's why I set that one aside in favor of a different game that isn't necessarily made as a storytelling game, but nonetheless still acts as a medium for storytelling, a blank sheet of paper that players can write their experiences on. After years of playing board games, this is something I've learned, because I remember many of the times and many of the crazy things that happened when I was playing board games with my friends, all of the crazy shared experiences that we had, right? All the stories that we've written together, maybe of challenges overcome, or just hilarious, funny things, unexpected events that happened, or devastating losses. You know, everything on the spectrum has happened from good to bad. But the point is, playing board games together helped us write stories together. Even though board games may not be a storytelling medium for everyone, and maybe not everyone wants to go into a board game wanting to write a story, I know that's not necessarily the first thing on my mind. I think that if we really look at board games through the lens of these 5 storytelling elements, the characters, the plot, the setting, the conflict, and the resolution, you might find something really special there. You might find that you and your friends can write some legendary stories together. My name's John, and this is what I've learned playing board games. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.